Support for Ben Franklin's World comes from the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, proud citizens of vast early America, and publishers of the Octo. The Octo is a rotating collection of 8 different blogs that explore different topics about early American history. Want to invigorate your lunch hour? Bookmark the Octo and click into new digital projects like Mapping Early American Elections, a project that includes interactive maps and visualizations of national and state congressional elections from between 1787 and 1825. Or, you could check out a discussion of why Black writers were so frequently absent in the bibliographic record on Past is Present, the blog of the American Antiquarian Society. The Omohundro Institute seeks to create awareness about early American history and about all the different ways that scholars are making their well-researched history available to everyone. And curating the Octo's collection of blogs is just one way that they do that. Bookmark benfranklinsworld.com/octo to stay up to date with all the latest news and discussions about early American history and about the wider world of vast early America.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 145 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In early America, society expected girls to grow up to become wives and mothers. Their role was in the home, so therefore they had few opportunities to receive a formal education beyond how to read, rear children, or tend to the matters of home life. So, it shouldn't be surprising that without a formal education, many men objected to women developing political viewpoints and participating in politics. But Mercy Otis Warren wasn't your typical early American woman. She was a woman who had strong political viewpoints, which she wrote about and published for the world to see. Did anyone in society take her views seriously? Did her writing sway public opinion in the direction of her political views? Today we begin a 6-episode series about people of the American Revolution. The Doing History to the Revolution series begins on September 12th, and almost all of its episodes focus on events and ideas of the Revolution and War for Independence. Therefore, it seemed fitting that we should also have a series focused on the people of the Revolution. Today, Rosemarie Zagarri, a professor of history at George Mason University and author of A Woman's Dilemma, Mercy Otis Warren and the American Revolution, helps us kick off this new series by taking us through the life and contributions of Mercy Otis Warren. During our investigation, Rosie reveals who Mercy Otis Warren was and why she was a remarkable woman, the roles 18th and early 19th century Americans expected girls and women to play in society, and details about Mercy Otis Warren's participation in the American Revolution and in the Constitution ratification debates. But first, don't forget that our next meetup is in Anaheim, California. I haven't set a time yet, but it will take place on Tuesday, August 22nd. Please let me know if you're interested in attending, because honestly, I could use some help planning it. Send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or join the conversation in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. Text BFWorld to 33444 to join. Alright, are you ready to embark on our 6-episode exploration of people of the American Revolution? Let's go meet our first guest and historic person.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a university professor and professor of history at George Mason University. She's received numerous fellowships to support her work on early American history, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's the author of 4 books, including Revolutionary Backlash, Women in Politics in the Early American Republic, and A Woman's Dilemma, Mercy Otis Warren and the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Rosemarie Zagarri.
Great, thank you for having me, Liz.
Now, Rosie, as you know, Mercy Otis Warren was a remarkable woman who lived throughout the American Revolution and into the early Republic. So I wonder, would you provide us with an overview of who she was and why she was so remarkable?
Mercy Otis Warren was born in 1728 in Massachusetts, and she died in 1814. So her life covered this incredibly long period that had an incredible number of important events. So she was born when Massachusetts was still a colony of Great Britain, and she died during the War of 1812 after the United States had staged a rebellion against Britain, become an independent country, and now was fighting Britain for the second time. What makes her so interesting and unusual is that she was a published author who wrote about political matters. And there are a number of reasons why this was atypical for the time. First of all, most women, most girls in colonial America received fairly little education. A lot of girls learned to read from their mothers, but not a lot of girls received a lot of formal education. And so Warren was highly educated. But from an early date, she displayed a remarkable facility as an author. And she used to write a lot of poems to herself or to her family members that she would share with her friends. And then in the 1760s, as tensions with Britain heated up, she began to write poems that had a political bent, that had a political point. And by the 1770s, relatives, her father, her brother, her husband, were encouraging her to publish her poems. And so she wrote some poems and plays, satirical plays, that actually attacked British tyranny, urged Americans to be vigilant against infringements on their liberties, and finally urged Americans to go to war. During the Revolution itself, she started writing a history of the American Revolution, and she knew many of the main participants herself, many of the leading characters, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. And she wrote this history of the American Revolution that was finally published in 3 volumes in 1805. And so she was a woman who had strong political beliefs, who was very well informed about political matters, and who actually took a lead in expressing those political ideas and facts through her writing.
You know, given how we think about education today, which is something that sets us up to be good, productive citizens of the Republic, it seems like 18th and early 19th century American society didn't really expect a whole lot from or for women.
Well, their idea of women's roles was very different from our own. As a child, Mercy Otis Warren, like most girls of her generation, expected to grow up to be a wife and mother. And she actually was a wife and mother. She married her husband, James Warren, when she was 25 or 26, and she had 5 children, 5 sons. And throughout her whole life, even despite her publishing career and her contributions to the American Revolution, she still regarded her role as wife and mother as primary. And so for a long time, female education was regarded as unimportant. In Massachusetts, where she lived, there were primary schools in a lot of towns that allowed girls to go to school. But beyond the basic elements of reading and writing, women did not usually receive a more advanced education. And when some girls went to school, they went to a private school, ladies' academy, where they learned only what were called the ornamental arts, like sewing or dancing or playing a musical instrument. But Warren was very different, and at a relatively young age, her father and her brother, James Otis, recognized her evident intelligence, and she began to be educated by a private tutor along with her brother. And through this education, she became acquainted with the great classics of ancient history, of literature, of geography. And so she gained a much broader and deeper education than most women and even a lot of men of her day. So her education really set her apart from the beginning, but nonetheless, she still expected that her life would be as a wife and mother. And it's because of the extraordinary circumstances that the resistance to Britain posed and the mounting tensions with Britain posed in the 1760s and 70s, she was finally able to use her intelligence and her abilities and put that to the service of the public good.
You mentioned Mercy's older brother, James Otis Jr., and in A Woman's Dilemma, you spoke about how Mercy and James had a very close relationship, one that not only allowed Mercy to gain access to a classical education, which, as we discussed, was well out of the reach of most women, but also how James introduced Mercy to her future husband, James Warren. Would you tell us more about Mercy's relationship with her brother, James Otis Jr.?
James Otis is a very prominent figure in pre-revolutionary America in his own right. Otis was a brilliant thinker and scholar. And after he finished his private tutoring alongside his sister, Mercy, he went on to Harvard. And of course, she could not go on to college. Colleges did not accept women. And, there was no opportunity for them to gain a formal higher education. But he was an outstanding student there. He went on to study to become a lawyer and became an early leader in the fight against British oppression. And so beginning in the 1760s, he took the lead in actually showing how British policies were infringing on American rights. So their relationship was incredibly close. And from the beginning, he encouraged their father to allow his sister, with her evident intelligence, to be tutored at the hands of Mr. Russell, who was also a minister. This education, of course, was crucial for Mercy, but it was crucial in advancing his career as well. But throughout his life, they remained in close touch, even though he went off to be a prominent lawyer and politician in Boston, which was some distance from her home in Plymouth. But they had a lot of correspondence, and they encouraged each other. They informed each other what was going on in their lives. And Mercy learned a lot about politics from him. At the same time, by the late 1760s, it was clear that he was becoming irrational. And finally, he was declared insane. And by 1771, he no longer played a part in the revolutionary movement. And this was a tragedy for Mercy Otis Warren, and actually a great blow to the revolutionary movement, because he was a brilliant political thinker. But in some ways, even though this may not have been conscious on Mercy Otis Warren's part, she felt a responsibility to take over in whatever ways she could from her brother in playing a role in the revolutionary movement. So after he no longer could because of his mental illness, she, through her writings, actually was able to make an important contribution.
James Otis Jr. participated in the early vanguard of the revolution, and he taught Mercy a lot about politics. Could we explore this a bit more? Could we talk first about how in 1761, James took on the British government by arguing against writs of assistance? What were writs of assistance? What arguments did Otis make against them? And why did John Adams seem to think that the child of independence was born within Otis's arguments?
That's a great quote, and I think it's an important moment that a lot of people are not familiar with. So this is long before the Stamp Act. This is actually during the French and Indian War. And so it's before most people in the colonies have any inkling of trouble with Great Britain. And what happened is that in 1760, George III came to the throne, and that was an important legal moment. But in this writs of assistance case, what happened was that it was common knowledge in colonial Massachusetts that there was a widespread smuggling by merchants of goods that were supposed to have a duty paid. Now, the merchants, of course, did not want to pay this money to the crown because they would have to charge more money to their consumers then, and they would have less profit. So there was widespread smuggling of goods. And on the ascension of George III to the throne, it was important that the writs of assistance, that is, the legal authority given to crown officials to search for smuggling or for supposed cases of smuggling, these are supposed to be renewed in the courts. And what happened was that after George ascended, there were cases in which the political authorities of Massachusetts did not renew the writs and were searching the warehouses. And the merchant community was outraged. They were up in arms about this. And there was this legal case. In the case, James Otis was one of the two lawyers defending the merchants of Boston and saying that these writs of assistance, which we today would call search warrants, we would call them search warrants. And as you know, today, in order to get a search warrant, the police have to have suspicion of a particular crime having been committed. In those days, you didn't have to have knowledge of a particular crime, but just a sort of general knowledge. But in any case, the merchants wanted to challenge the legality of these writs, and James Otis took on this case. But when he made his argument before the judge in this case, he argued not on the specific merit of the issue, but rather made an argument about how these writs of assistance violated the natural rights of the colonists. That by not having knowledge of specific crimes being committed and searching their warehouses for contraband goods, these merchants were having their natural rights violated. And it's this use of the idea of natural rights that became extremely important in later colonial arguments against British oppression of the colonies. And so by using this argument that colonists had a fundamental right to privacy, to be protected against infringements by legal officials, by the security apparatus of the state, unless there was knowledge of a particular crime, he really expanded the scope of arguments that the colonists could use in later years in attacking Britain's infringements on their rights and liberties. And so he really foreshadowed important developments in American political thought and in American resistance to Great Britain.
What did Mercy think of James's ideas and argument? Did the two siblings correspond or discuss this case at all?
Well, at that time, remember, it's 1760, the British colonists and troops from Great Britain are fighting France and Native Americans in a war. And after this war is over in 1763, Americans are thrilled to be part of the British Empire. And so in 1760, most colonists had no inkling that there would be a war of rebellion, in a decade and a half. And so at this time, then, Mercy Otis Warren did not really exchange her thoughts or comments about the case with James Otis, her brother. And on top of that, she was in the middle of her childbearing years where she was having her 5 sons. So it was early in her marriage and she was preoccupied with other matters. But my main point is that I don't think people appreciated the significance of the writs of assistance case at the time. And in fact, James Otis and his partner lost the case. The Crown ruled against them. And so, the writs of assistance pertained. It's only in retrospect that John Adams could see the full implications of what James Otis was arguing there.
Okay, so at the start of the imperial crisis, which we only recognize today as the start of the imperial crisis because hindsight is 2020, Mercy was in the midst of her new marriage and in her prime childbearing years. Rosie, would you tell us about Mercy's relationship with her husband, James Warren, who also became a prominent Massachusetts revolutionary?
It's clear that they met through her brother, through James Otis. James Warren and James Otis attended Harvard together, and at some point they probably were introduced to one another. What's interesting, though, is that they didn't marry until she was 26 and he was 28, which is a little older than average for people in Massachusetts at this time. And it's clear that they had a very close and very loving relationship. In the early years of the resistance movement, particularly in the 1760s, James Warren was very active in the revolutionary movement. One of the interesting things is that James Warren and Mercy Otis Warren lived in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Their house was on the road between Boston and other parts of Massachusetts. James Otis and John Adams were attorneys. And at that time, attorneys often had to travel around the colony to generate business. They didn't stay in one place and have all the clients come to them. So during the 1760s, James Otis and John Adams would often stop at their house. And while they were there, beginning in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act and then followed in 1768 with the Townshend Acts, both of which imposed taxes on the colonists without their consent, the Warren household in Plymouth became a kind of salon for revolutionaries. And they would discuss all sorts of political matters before the fireside. It's believed that the plan for the Stamp Act Congress was first generated there, that a plan for committees of correspondence to relay information from colony to colony first was proposed there, and that other ideas about resisting British policies were originated right there in the Warren household. So naturally, James Warren was a participant in all this. He was the local political leader in Plymouth. Later on, he would serve in various political bodies. Before the Revolution, he served in the colonial legislature and there was a kind of agitator against British policies, and particularly against the policies of the hated royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson. But what is most interesting to me, actually, is that once the Revolution began in 1776, Mercy Otis Warren put a lot of pressure on her husband to resign from his offices or to not even accept various offices at state or national level. He actually kind of sat out the Revolution, even though he had a position as the Paymaster General of the Continental Army. He resigned that. He refused a lot of positions in the Massachusetts government. He really wanted to be home. And part of the reason he wanted to be home was because she claimed that she was ill. And it looks like there were two issues. One, she was increasingly afflicted with an eye disease that made it very difficult for her to see, but also she seemed to suffer from depression. And we have a lot of letters in which she explicitly asks her husband, James, to come and be with her. It's really a very interesting counterpoint to this strong woman who is writing these very assertive diatribes against the British government, against their royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson, who is very harsh and critical of those governments, but yet who is so weak and vulnerable and dependent on her husband in her private life. It's hard to not see that, she depended on him a great deal, and part of her ability to succeed as a writer was due to support from her husband, and that she simply could not allow him to be gone for very long. What I stress in the book is that this makes her, in some sense, what you might call a bad Republican mother. There's this whole idea among historians that good wives during the American Revolution were willing to sacrifice their husbands and their sons for the sake of the revolution, for the sake of the republic. They would let them go off to serve in the government. They would let them go off to serve in the military. And this came at a great cost to the women because they would then have to take over the husband's duties on the home front. They would have to be the only parent at home with the children. They would have to take care of the farm or the business. They would have to manage the family's finances. If they had slaves, they would have to take care of the slaves. Not that the Warrens had slaves, but they did have servants. So they would have to manage all of that on their own. So the American Revolution really extracted a lot of sacrifices from women and wives, even though they didn't actually serve in the army or serve in the government. People at the time, commentators, writers, ministers, politicians, all recognized that women's support of their husband's service was essential to the revolution's success. But in this sense, Mercy Otis Warren deviated from that norm. She really demanded that her husband be home with her and not fulfill his duty to his country. And this was noticed by other revolutionaries, in particular by John and Abigail Adams, and they criticized the Warrens privately for their selfishness, not to put too fine a point on it. This was a strain on their relationship because John Adams was gone from his home for months and then years at a time when he went abroad as a diplomat. It was remarkable, I think, that Mercy Otis Warren was not willing to allow her husband to perform in this role of public service once the American Revolution started. He did serve on the Navy board for a few years, but that did not require him to be away from home for a very long period of time. So I think this is an interesting kind of relationship that they had, one of mutual dependence, one of absolute commitment to this new cause of independence and to the new republic, but it had its limits when it came to James Warren being away from home for long periods of time or putting his life at risk by serving in the Continental Army.
I'd like for us to explore Mercy's political beliefs and her participation in the Revolution a bit more. Throughout A Woman's Dilemma, Rosie notes that Mercy participated in politics only because the men around her encouraged her and allowed her to do so. Rosie, why did the men around Mercy allow her to participate in politics, and why did Mercy even need their permission to do so?
First of all, it's important to understand that women were politically invisible at this time. They didn't vote, they didn't hold public office, and it was rare in the colonial period for women to even express their political ideas in public or in print. Partly it's because at this time, the most obvious route to political participation was through the ownership of property. Owning property allowed you to vote. This was true both in Britain and in the British colonies. And women who were married were not allowed to own property. So they were excluded by law, but also by custom. By custom, politics was thought to be the realm of men. It was a masculine realm. Women were not supposed to involve themselves in political matters, to think about arcane issues of war and finance and economics and, government processes. They were supposed to be primarily concerned with their role as wives and mothers. And, of course, because women did not have high degrees of education in general, they tended not to be so interested. What's interesting about the Revolutionary period, even prior to the Revolution, after 1750 or 60, you see rising literacy rates for women. So more and more women could read. And of course, we know Mercy Otis Warren could not only read, but she could write eloquently, and she was highly educated, but also a proliferation in the number of materials printed in the United States. So there was an explosion in the number of newspapers, printed pamphlets, books, all sorts of printed materials. So as women could read more, there was more to read, and they became more informed about politics. Nonetheless, there was still a lot of popular prejudice about women thinking about, speaking about, even in private, their political views, and then to write about these ideas in public was taboo. I want to note that in her early publications, Mercy Otis Warren did not sign her name. She wrote under a pseudonym or anonymously. Now, I want to emphasize here that that was not just women who did that. Men and women authors did this, especially when they were writing about political matters, because there were very strict libel laws in Britain and in British North America. So they wanted to avoid being prosecuted under libel laws. But there was a double reason for Mercy Otis Warren to write anonymously. The problem was that, if people knew that a woman had penned something about politics, there probably would have been a backlash against it, a bias against it, prejudice against it. So, she made the choice, and the choice was made for her not to write under her own name in this era before the American Revolution. I should note that in 1790, after the Revolution, she did publish a volume of her poems and plays and did produce it under her own name. And then in 1805, her History of the American Revolution was published under her own name. So that was an interesting change that happened before and after the Revolution. Back to your question about the support she received from the men in her life. As I mentioned, her brother, James Otis, was really important in getting their father to allow her to receive this highly sophisticated education that made her so different from most other women. And Otis was very supportive of her writing these political poems and plays. So that was one male who was very important in her life. The other two men were her husband, James Warren, who also encouraged his wife to write and publish in the service of the resistance cause and then the revolutionary cause. And in a sense, if he had been very opposed to this, it would have been very difficult for Warren to undertake these efforts because it would have required a direct challenge to his authority. Although Mercy Otis Warren was a strong woman, she was also very deferential to him. So I think her husband's support of her efforts was very important. And then finally, John Adams, who was a family friend who frequently visited their house, actively encouraged Mercy Otis Warren to write for publication on these political matters. In one case in particular, he encouraged her after the Boston Tea Party in 1773 to write and publish a poem celebrating the Tea Party and the Americans' overt challenge to British authority by dumping all those chests of tea into Boston Harbor. So that was very significant. And Mercy Otis Warren and John Adams had a friendship independent of their wives and husbands. They had a very deep correspondence where they talked about political matters. They encouraged each other in their patriotism. And what's also interesting is that John Adams also encouraged Mercy Otis Warren to write her magnum opus, the 3-volume history of the American Revolution, that she began to write in 1776 after independence was declared. This was critical to her development as an author. And the reason I think that these men were willing to give her such support, even though she was transgressing into a male realm, is because it was for this larger public good. It was for the service of the American Revolution. They obviously saw that she was an exceptional woman who had a unique talent to help the cause, and so they supported her. Now, what this means is that they were not generally so supportive in terms of women entering the political realm. It doesn't translate from these men supporting the idea of this unusual woman in an unusual situation stepping forward to write and publish on political matters to a more generalized idea that all women should be able to speak and write and publish on political matters. So it was the situation itself, I think, that allowed these individuals to use what James Warren, Mercy's husband, called her masculine genius in the service of the revolutionary cause. It's a very interesting situation where the particularities of the time called forth Mercy Otis Warren's talents as a political author and political thinker, and in which the men around her, recognizing that, encouraged her to develop and use those talents in the service of the cause.
So what were Mercy Otis Warren's particular writing talents? I mean, what exactly and how exactly did she write to support the revolution?
She begins to write poems and plays as a youngster, as a teenager, and as a young mother. She is writing poems to her husband and for circulation among her friends and families. This was not actually very unusual at the time. A lot of people circulated manuscripts for the entertainment and edification of their friends and family. But as I mentioned, her family recognized that she did have exceptional talent. And after her brother was no longer able to participate because of his mental illness, she either consciously or subconsciously took on his mantle and began to write for publication. And so her first published political work was in 1772, and it was a satirical play. We would probably call it propaganda, and it was called The Adulator, and it was really a play that was an attack, a satire on Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson, who was the hated and much maligned royal official in the colonies, also the judge in the Supreme Court, who many inhabitants of Massachusetts believed was conspiring to deprive the colonists of their liberties and to ally with officials in Great Britain to undermine their rights. So this was a very powerful piece. Now, I want to emphasize that this piece was not meant to be performed on stage. It was rather probably something that people would either just read or, read in the parlor in the evening. Reading aloud was very common then. It was a form of entertainment. That's what it was intended for. It was published in 2 installments in a Massachusetts newspaper, and that was a very common way to convey political ideas at this time. Again, this was published anonymously, but among a circle of Massachusetts patriots, it was known who the real author was. Then in 1773, she published another satirical play. I mentioned this important poem about the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And then throughout this whole period to the Revolution, she was also publishing political poems that urged people to make sacrifices in terms of what they bought or what they wore for the sake of the boycotts against Britain. The boycotts were an effort to hurt Britain economically after the passage of these laws that tried to tax the colonists without their consent. Some of these poems were directed specifically to women in an effort to get women to understand that they too had a political role to play, that by not buying fancy china or silverware or fancy hats from Great Britain, they were making a political statement, and that instead of doing these things, they should dress simply, they should think about the larger issues at stake, and that they should sacrifice for the sake of this resistance against Great Britain. So Warren understood that women as well as men were in her audience, and she was directing her poems and plays to these men and women. As I said, they were published mostly in newspapers until 1774. She had a pamphlet published of one of her plays called The Group. What's interesting here is that her rhetoric, her language, even though it's in the form of a play, is getting more aggressive. It's calling for people to be ready to take up arms in the case of British attacks, in the case of more active infringements on American rights and liberties. But I want to note, too, that throughout this whole time, she was afraid that she might be transgressing too much into male territory. And at one point she writes that she worries that she not approach anything so far from the line of my sex. She was worried that she's getting too involved in politics, and it's only with the continuing support of people like John Adams and her husband that she writes on these political matters. You know, she started her History of the American Revolution during the Revolution itself, but it wasn't published until 1805. So some of her works were published in newspapers or as pamphlets, others as standalone books.
And yet, it seems like it was good for the Patriots that Mercy Otis Warren went beyond traditional sex roles, because it seems like she had a real talent for taking big, complex ideas of the day and translating them into poems and plays that allowed everyday people to grapple with them.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And in my book, I contrast her opposition to the U.S. Constitution with that of her husband, James Warren. She published a pamphlet opposing the Constitution. She published this under the pseudonym A Columbian Patriot. And I think today when we read her writing, it seems kind of inflated and bombastic and overstated. But she had a real talent with words, and her attack on the Constitution, published in 1788, really was widely read. It was republished in other states, and it was cited by other authors. Whereas her husband, James Warren, wrote a tract opposing the Constitution, and it sort of sank from sight. It really did not have any influence beyond a limited circle of readers in Massachusetts. I think that it was her way with words. It was her way to get to the heart of the matter that really appealed to people. And she didn't rest in the realm of abstract ideas. She was able to get to the emotional heart of the matter, to appeal to people's emotions as well as to their intellect. And I think that was one of the secrets of her writing. And she was also very good at sketching characters and very good at making out, letting the reader know where she stood, what was good, what was bad, and by implication, what ideas she was supporting through her work.
Wow. Mercy Otis Warren was against the Constitution? That's not what we'd really expect from somebody from Massachusetts.
Good point, yes. Because she had been so much in favor of the American Revolution, I think a lot of people would assume that she would be in favor of the Constitution. It's important to know, though, that Mercy Otis Warren's interests were formed by a very strong commitment to what historians call classical republicanism, to an idea that virtue and sacrifice for the public good should animate people's actions. And what she saw around her after the revolution was a lot of falling away from that idea. But she didn't think the solution was a stronger central government. So remember, the revolution ends in 1783. We have 13 states which each have their own constitution that govern the states internally. There's the Articles of Confederation that create a Congress that governs the Union, but that has very limited powers. And so it's during the 1780s that some people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison become convinced that only a strong central government can keep the Union together. But people like Mercy Otis Warren and her husband think that the state governments at the local level are really the best means to promote virtue, encourage loyalty, to protect individual rights and liberties. And so when the framers gather in Philadelphia in 1787, she's very concerned about what's going on. And when the Constitution is then published and submitted to the states for approval, for ratification, each state has to gather a convention and then vote whether it accepts the Constitution or not. Now, Massachusetts was more divided than you would think on the Constitution. There were a lot of people who were convinced that the Constitution was not the answer, that you could strengthen the powers of the Confederation government and satisfy the problems that were racking the country. But Warren believed, like many anti-federalists, that the Constitution created a government that was too far away from the people it served. So wherever the seat of government would be, it would be far distant from a lot of the citizens of the country, and therefore the government would not be very responsive to the people's needs and wishes and desires. It would not be a government that would be in touch with the people. It created what she believed was a kind of aristocracy, that the people that would be elected to Congress would be wealthy people whose interests were very different from the majority of people. She thought that it would be difficult for the people in the states to control that government. She thought the government would be susceptible to corruption, and it might result in a centralization of power. And like many other anti-federalists, she was very concerned that although this Constitution created a much stronger form of central government, a national government, it did not contain a Bill of Rights. While many state constitutions had bills of rights, this proposed Constitution did not protect the right to freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the right to petition. It did not protect you from unwarranted search and seizure, ex post facto laws. There was a whole range of issues by which the stronger central government could infringe on the rights and liberties of people. So she was very adamant that if there were to be a new government embodied in the Constitution, it needed to have a Bill of Rights. But her preference was that this new government just be defeated and they work with the existing Articles of Confederation.
Now, earlier you told us that in 1805, Mercy Otis Warren published her 3-volume history on the American Revolution. Would you tell us about Warren's history and how it fit in with her other political writing?
Well, it's actually very different from most of the writing she had done before because she had written poems and plays, and in 1790 had published a selected volume of those poems and plays. But John Adams had encouraged her to sort of chronicle the American Revolution, and since she knew many of the leading participants, she could request documents from them. She could ask them questions about what happened. And so she felt like she was sort of a participant observer, I guess you would say, but a recorder of the history. Since the outcome of the revolution was unknown when she started it, it was not till after 1783 that she could really be sure she could write a positive history of what happened. So it took her many years to complete this, and she worked on it in fits and starts. Her eyes were failing at this time, so it was actually harder for her to write after 1776 than it was before. The other thing is that during the 1790s, political parties emerged. The emergence of this division between the supporters of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who were called the Democratic Republicans, as opposed to those who supported George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, the Federalists, was really a significant and profound disappointment to her, but also a sort of watershed for her, because although most people in Massachusetts supported the Federalists, the centralizers, those who were in favor of a pro-British strong government, she and her husband were supporters of Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans. She favored the kind of small government, state-centered government that the Jeffersonians approved. She was very suspicious of the strong nationalizing tendencies with the Bank of the United States, with a strong national army, with a lot of federal government influence on the states that the Federalists represented. And so as she worked on her history of the American Revolution during the 1790s, her political views were evolving. And while her history of the events of the War for Independence itself and the prelude to that are fairly uncontroversial, she takes her account into the 1790s and talks about the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. Those are more colored by her pro-Jeffersonian political views. So she's fairly critical of George Washington and his pro-British sympathies as she understood them. She's very critical of John Adams and what she perceives as his pro-British sympathies, and in her view, his moving away from the principles of the American Revolution. She's also very critical of what she sees as the American people's decline away from the principles of simplicity and virtue that she thinks informed the American Revolution, that she thinks made the American Revolution successful. And she's worried about the decline in this commitment to the common good and a sense of selfishness and self-interestedness that is overtaking the country. And she worries whether the government can succeed, whether the country can succeed if the people are not possessed of these virtues. And so it's a very interesting book whose tone changes over the course of the book. And for a while, she had almost given up the idea of publishing it. And her son actually took over and wrote what she dictated, and he encouraged her to continue it. But it wasn't until the early 1800s, until the first years of the 19th century, after Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1800, that she felt optimistic enough about the future of the country to go ahead and publish it. And so at this time, the way you published a book is you subscribers who help put up some of the money for a printer to publish it. And she was able to get enough to get it published. But when she had it published in 1805, only 800 of the 1,500 copies were sold. And she didn't get the approval that had met her earlier works. And in fact, some of the reviews criticized her, and they criticized her partly because they didn't like her politics, but partly because she was a woman writing about matters of war and violence and government and economics and politics. It was a controversial work, and she was very disappointed in its reception. So this was really kind of a shock to her. And what was even more of a shock to her was that the person who had most encouraged her to write the work, John Adams, was very critical and hostile to her history of the American Revolution. And part of the reason was he didn't like the way she depicted him. Adams thought that Warren had underestimated his contributions to the American Revolution. She had overlooked some of his important sacrifices for the cause, some of his important interventions. In fact, Adams had been really the workhorse in the Continental Congress and done so many things, but he didn't think Warren acknowledged those. And his diplomatic efforts abroad in France and then in negotiating the treaty that ended the war, he didn't believe she really understood the details of that. Then he also really was offended by the way she treated his presidency, where she painted him as a kind of crypto monarch. And this, again, was influenced by her pro-Jeffersonian views. So I think this really was devastating to her. He wrote her a series of letters, 11 letters, where he just ripped the book apart almost line by line where it dealt with him. And she tried to rebut him, but he absolutely would not take any of her replies seriously, and he basically dismissed her. It ended in an abrupt rupture of their relationship where they didn't speak for many, many years. He wrote privately, that is, John Adams wrote privately to Elbridge Gerry that he believed that history was not the province of the ladies, that women should be concerned with, their own female matters, the matters of household, children, religion, virtue, but not with important male matters. So it's a very interesting turnabout in their relationship and in his attitude toward Mercy Otis Warren publishing. And as I say, it created this breach between them that was healed only about 1814. Abigail Adams intervened and reestablished the connection. But on the other hand, there was never the warmth or familiarity in their relationship as there had been before.
From everything we've talked about today, it sounds like Mercy Otis Warren was both a feminist in that she believed she should be able to participate in politics and participated in them, and also someone who was not a feminist in that she sought and needed the support of the men in her life in order to participate in politics, and she was really deferential to her husband. So, Rosie, was Mercy Otis Warren someone we could and should look upon as an early American feminist?
In the book, I call her a feminist without feminism. Actually, of course, the word feminist is a contemporary word, and Warren and other people at the time in the 18th century would not have even known what that means. But even on our own terms, I think it's hard to call Mercy Otis Warren a feminist. She definitely transgressed the typical feminine role for the time. She ventured into male territory in writing about and publishing on politics and war, matters that were not considered in the purview of women. But she did so only with the permission of the men around her in these exceptional circumstances of the revolutionary crisis. Now, she did gain confidence over time, and by the 1790s and the time of the publication of her history, she had confidence enough to put her name on her work when she published it, and she was very proud of her work. So that indicates, I think, some sort of evolution in her belief in women's ability to be public figures in the sense of recognized public authors, even on controversial matters. But I'm not sure that that makes her a feminist. She also definitely did not assert any support for the idea of women voting or holding public office. But what she did believe in, and this was true of many other educated women and some men at the time, was that women should have the chance to be equally educated with men, and that women shared with men equal intellectual ability and capacity. So she really believed that women had the same right as men to gain an education and to be respected as thinkers in regard to their ability to make intellectual contributions. But she didn't translate that into the public political realm. So I think in that sense, modern feminists would not regard her as one of them. She was not the vanguard of a feminist movement. She was not really someone who would wage a public campaign to expand women's political role in the early republic.
Now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if Mercy Otis Warren had not written about politics during the American Revolution? If Warren had not written her political satires and poetry, would support for the revolution have been different in Massachusetts?
I think there are very few people who are indispensable to the coming of the revolution. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, later on James Madison. So in that sense, I think the American Revolution would have happened in Massachusetts without Mercy Otis Warren's contributions. But more generally, I think without Mercy Otis Warren, Massachusetts would not have been as radicalized, as quickly, and as articulately as it was. I think Warren helped make people realize the stakes that the British infringements on their rights and liberties posed. She alerted them to the danger of Thomas Hutchinson. She spread that word. She did it in a way that appealed to their feelings as well as to their intellect. So I think she helped mobilize a larger audience in support of resistance to British tyranny and then the American Revolution. That doesn't mean it wouldn't have happened without her, but I think she was critical in that. I also think more generally, she, as a woman, spoke to other women, specifically appealed to other women about the need for their support for the boycotts against British goods. She spoke to women about what they could do to help support the cause. She alerted women to the fact that their sacrifices would have a political impact on the resistance movement and later on the war for independence. So again, would this have happened without her? Probably. But did she help sharpen the focus? Did she help spread the word? Did she make people more aware of it? I think yes, all those things. And I think in retrospect, the fact that after the revolution, she was willing to put her name on her political writing was very brave of her. It cost her in terms of becoming an object of public disapproval. It was painful for her, and yet it raised the profile of women and made people aware that the American Revolution had had an impact on women. I think that in the way that people understood that citizens included not only men, but women too, her public presence really helped start to change the way people thought about what a democracy was, what the new republic meant, what the ideas of equality and natural right could mean in the future.
So, Rosie, we need to offer you congratulations because A Woman's Dilemma is now available in a 20th anniversary revised and updated edition. Congratulations, Rosie. Perhaps you could tell us what we can find in this new updated edition of your book.
Well, I was really delighted when the book was republished after 20 years. I think that the book helps you understand a lot of different parts of early American history. It helps you understand in a much deeper and more personal way the role of women before the revolution, during the colonial era, the role as wives and mothers. It helps you understand the coming of the revolution because she was a political creature and her family was so political. Mercy Otis Warren's life helps us understand the ideas of the revolution and why Americans felt that, the British taxes, why the British policies were threatening their customary rights and liberties. I think it helps you understand the impact of the revolution on people's lives. And then in the post-revolutionary period, the emergence of political parties and how much it created division and threatened the future of the entire United States. And so I think the book has appealed to a lot of audiences. And I think it's a very engaging way for people to come to have a deeper understanding of the period. And so I'm really grateful and delighted that it's sold for this period of time, and I hope that even more people find it useful in this new edition.
Is there a place where we should go to find more information about you and how to contact you if we have questions?
Yes, I'm a professor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. So I'm listed on the faculty page there, and you can find my bio and contact information. You can also obtain the book through Wiley Blackwell's website.
Rosemarie Zagarri, thank you for helping us explore the life and times of Mercy Otis Warren.
Thank you.
Mercy Otis Warren was truly a remarkable woman. Thanks to her father and brother, Warren had something that few early American women had, a classical education. And Mercy used this to her advantage. She used her knowledge of history, political theory, and writing to participate in revolutionary politics at an elite level. Now, Warren may not have served in the Continental Congress or held a prominent diplomatic or military position, but she did play a prominent part in cultivating and swaying public opinion to the Patriots' cause. As Rosie noted, Warren primarily wrote poetry and satirical plays, works that made fun of prominent men like Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, rallied support for the actions of the Boston Tea Party, and appealed to women in a way that animated them to join the cause. Now, although Warren was unique in that her talents as a writer allowed her to have a real individual voice in the revolution, Mercy never forgot that she was a woman. She participated in politics only because the men around her encouraged her and allowed her to do so. Still, Mercy recognized that women had important roles to play in the revolution, and she used her poetry to remind him of that. Now, Warren's actions don't qualify her as a feminist or even the vanguard of a feminist movement, but they do reflect that she was a strong, formidable woman trying to take advantage of the opportunities the American Revolution provided. And she made a big difference, all while living within and without the constraints that early American society placed on women. Look for more information about Rosie, her book, A Woman's Dilemma, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/145. Those proud citizens of vast early America at the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture made today's episode possible, because part of the Omohundro Institute's mission is to do what it can to create more awareness about early American history and about all the different ways historians are making their research available to everyone. This is why the Omohundro Institute created the Octo, a rotating feature of 8 different blogs covering all sorts of unique projects and topics about the history of vast early America. So be sure to check out this awesome feature by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/octo. Okay, if you had lived during the American Revolution, do you think you would have been able to answer the call to sacrifice the presence or life of your child or spouse for the cause? And remember, you have to make this sacrifice without knowing how the cause would turn out. Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.